Good evening, everyone, or good afternoon here on the West Coast. And just a huge thanks, first of all, to Judy and our friends in the Institute for Evangelism. That I'm not always sure that Judy realizes how much of an encouragement the Institute is to so many of us across the country. The good work that you do and that you have done now for decades has had a huge impact. And so I laughed a bit when I saw that the statement that I guess the two of us are the only two. Before people jump on us, I think what we mean by that is the only two in mainline seminaries in Canada. We'd love to be corrected. In fact, we'd love to be wrong 1,000 times over. But the whole focus on evangelism is something that is desperately in need of attention. So to have a great colleague like Judy, I'm just so grateful. And the other panelists as well. Thank you so much. I'm excited to hear from Jared and from Susan. Been asked tonight to talk a little bit about where we've seen God at work regarding mission during the pandemic. So I'll jump in, and in the ultimate triumph of style over substance, I prepared PowerPoint slides. Hooray. So we'll fire up the PowerPoint machine here. And these are some reflections that have just been accumulating throughout this pandemic. And what an odd time this has been in many ways for so many of us. I think the last time I saw Jared was here in Vancouver in person at a church planting gathering that the Anglican diocese hosted, and it was wonderful. And I miss seeing people in person. I'm an extreme extrovert. Part of it is I grew up in Manitoba, where Friendly Manitoba is the license plate, and you're trained kind of to talk to strangers at all times. And so pandemic is hard for extroverts. So it's good to be together with all of you. I just want to share a few reflections tonight, and then I hope for friends who are engaging in this webinar that you'll pop some questions for all of us on the panel into the chat box as we go along. I think the first place to start is to recognize that that the mainline church, or what I teach my students here on the West Coast to actually call the formerly mainline. I get worried that the language of mainline is still interpreted as mainstream, and I think that actually works against us. So the formerly mainline church was in a difficult spot pre-pandemic. We know that. Great colleagues of Judy's at U of T, Brian Clark at Emmanuel College, and my friend Stuart McDonald at Knox College did a terrific piece of work, if you haven't had a look at it, Leaving Christianity, McGill Queen's Press, in which they narrate the steps, statistically speaking, of what we all know and have lived through, which is decline of the mainline denominations. We know that the church was kind of turned upside down pre-pandemic, and that the pandemic has only accelerated certain aspects of Christian witness and mission that were either thriving or lacking before that. I think in many ways what this time has been for the folks that I talk to, it has been kind of a refresher course, an invitation by God to ask, what is the church? What is ecclesia? And as we know, ecclesia is mentioned, 114 times in the New Testament, and it always means a people, a summoned people, a called out people. And so this has been a time for mission and witness in which we've had to reconfigure the way in which we are God's people together. And that has brought us face to face at times with how we have been the people of God in ways that have been unhelpful. Most recently here in British Columbia, right across the country, of course, and indeed around the world, but we have just been heartbroken, really challenged. Later in the chat box, I will pop an article written by one of our St. Andrews Hall students who is Indigenous and in Kamloops works with the First Nations, the Indigenous Band, a reflection on this. This has been a reminder to us, once again, of how high the stakes are when it comes to talking about mission. And this is something that I think we need to circle back to, because some of us operate so far now outside of the lens of Christendom that it's important for us to remember that when we talk about mission, we continue to bring with us the legacy of colonialism. And so the response in many ways for us here on the West Coast has been to embrace missional theology. That's certainly the work that I do through the Center for Missional Leadership, understanding that God's mission uses the church as sign, instrument, foretaste, to borrow Newbegin's language, of what God is actually doing in the world. Our colleague here at the Center for Missional Leadership, Daryl Guter, speaks of mission as not something that the church does. It's part of its total program, and mission is founded on the mission of God in the world rather than the church's effort to extend itself. So what has God been teaching us? And I'm going to answer this in a few ways, but I'm hoping already for participants, this is sparking for you ideas of what God has been doing. How has God reshaped our Christian witness and mission through the pandemic? I'm pretty amazed and excited about what God has been up to. The first is, I think one of the lessons has been that pre-pandemic, I think maybe we asked too much from Sunday mornings. When you think about how much we tried to cram in to Sunday morning alone in order to help form mature disciples of Christ to live their faith, their apostolate, when they are out in the world the rest of the week, I think the pandemic has revealed to us how inadequate that brief time together has been. Of course, we have great folks like David Fitch, who long ago have been encouraging us to think not only of Sunday morning, where Jesus meets us as host, but our role as host in our homes, and then where we go open-handed. Just as we come to the communion rail and wait for sacrament, we have that same posture out in the world, looking for what God is up to. Vancouver-based missiologist Alan Roxborough speaks in terms of being a detective of divinity, right? Looking for clues about the triune God's active presence in the world. We know this because we have an incarnational faith. At least that's what we profess. And yet, I think this time has been quite a serious time of dislocation, disorientation for us. Even the way we're gathered now has become normal, but oh my goodness, early Zoom church and Zoom Christian meetings were painful, weren't they, as people were figuring out technology. And so we've had to figure out how to be incarnational in different ways. Here's something else that I think God has been really lifting up for us during this when it comes to mission. Many of us were raised to say the church is not the building, right? We get that. And yet it's been so interesting for us now for well over a year, many of us, to be outside of our physical gathering space. So what do we do with our church buildings when we return to them? And how have churches been using their buildings for mission? One of the examples that I love is right here in British Columbia in a suburb of Vancouver called Surrey. This is a church where I was interim moderator, which is Presbyterian speak for looking after a church when it doesn't have a pastor. They have a great pastor now. And it's located in the poorest postal code in Surrey, a high immigrant population. And they decided to use their building to serve meals for the homeless community that are often right on the doorstep of the church. They've long had a hot dog ministry on the front steps of the church, and depicted here as one of the city councilors in Surrey, who's a member of the church, who has taken to social media in a fierce way to bring together members of the local Islamic Association and other community groups to work together to feed their neighbors. And it's been a remarkable thing. So City Center Church has been such an encouraging example of how to repurpose their building when they couldn't be in it for mission. And I'm sure we'll hear other examples of how buildings have been used in proactive ways when we couldn't gather for worship in them. Something else that I'd love for us to reflect on is, what has God taught you about your discipleship at home? The worst of Christendom was what I would call outsourcing our baptismal vows to paid clergy. You be Christian for me, priest or pastor. I'll bring my kids, I'll put money in the plate kind of thing. But for so many of us, we've had to figure out, and I have 3 kids under my roof, how do you disciple? How do you help kids and teenagers grow in their faith in the Lord Jesus Christ in a time when we can't gather in church and have Sunday school and youth group? Yes, there's online versions, But I find my teens and so forth, they really struggle. They're on Zoom all the time for school. They're not really interested in church online. And so I wonder what God has been teaching us about the home as the formation center. I know for my wife and I, we've had long conversations about what God is calling us to do from a missional perspective, to not only minister to our kids, but also our neighbors. I have a hunch people listening right now can tell stories about how they've gotten to know their neighbors far better in this time of pandemic than they knew before. Here's an example of a couple of examples. On the left is Angie Song, pastor of On Community Church north of Toronto, which is our largest Korean Presbyterian church in the denomination. And they took their Alpha program online, and it just flourished. It had always had traction to a certain degree, but having members in their homes rather than inviting them to a church building, it took off like crazy. Andrea Parrott, depicted on the right, is an associate in our Center for Missional Leadership. She has a bread baking circle that gathers folks once a month. There's a liturgy they go through, and then they bake bread together, and they bake an extra loaf and take it to a neighbor as an act of witness. It was going fine pre-pandemic. It's exploded during the pandemic because they can gather people across the country for this now. And so using our homes as a place of witness and mission has been fascinating to me. One of the things that I continue to puzzle about is we know as Christians all we need is Jesus, amen. But apparently a lot of our affable agnostic neighbors, when the pandemic broke out, all they really needed was toilet paper. Do you remember those early days? That was crazy. And there's this sense in which I continue to puzzle when it comes to Christian witness and mission, that some of us will still remember ministering, say, during 9/11. I was in Nova Scotia as an associate pastor, and churches flooded with people after that event. How did that go for you at the beginning of the pandemic? I didn't have a lot of my affable agnostic neighbors knocking down my door saying, Ross, what must I do to be saved? It was more like, do you need toilet paper? And so I think this has been a clarifying time for us about how we witness to those who do not yet know Jesus as Lord and Savior. And some of our assumptions that when people are in trouble, they will turn towards the church have finally been clarified. Some of us had suspicions about that before, but I think en masse it's been helpful. And then finally, I think when it comes to Christian witness and mission, to quote our prime minister, not being political here, but you remember early in the pandemic, he spoke a really creepy phrase. He invited Canadians to not speak moistly on each other. And then he took back the phrase right away, because it is creepy. Let's just be honest, terrible expression. But I was thinking about how, as Christians, of course, we cling to the promise of an incarnational faith, that God was in the flesh in Jesus Christ to reveal fully who God is to us. And so I think when it comes to mission and witness, one of the challenges moving forward, and a lot of churches right now are wrestling with this, how much do they continue online? When they return to in person, what does that look like? We're longing for incarnation. And so what I'll leave us with is a couple of questions when I resource churches during this time. One is I invite churches to tell me what they have started during the pandemic that they pray God will continue when the pandemic is over. And almost always it is a story of innovation, and it often involves technology. It is about connection. I have churches where the elders on session now, one elder is the online elder, and they're offering pastoral care and prayer and follow-up support to people from around the world who are worshiping with them. Amazing. But then I ask them, what's one thing you've stopped doing? Something churchy is usually how I phrase it, that you pray God you'll never start again. And those are almost always stories of Christian traditions that many of us would pray, like the flea market could die years ago, but have been carrying on, and no one's had the courage to put it down. And so what is it now, for the sake of Christian witness and mission, that we're actually going to lay down and say, we're not picking that up from the table when we can finally go to whatever this next phase of ministry might look like? So those are some of my thoughts. I look forward to your questions and engaging and hearing from the rest of our panelists as well.
It's really wonderful to be with you all and talk about my favorite thing, which is mission. But I just want to start with a thank you to Judy and company for putting this evening together. Not only is it great to be part of this conversation for its own sake, but in thinking about what I was going to say this evening, it really caused me to go back to the beginning of the pandemic in my own notes and through recent diocesan history. And there was even more creativity and hope than I thought. So, the whole thing was like a prayer. Thanks be to God. Um, so I thought this evening that I'd put my observations into three categories, which sit under the mission umbrella. The first category is listening to one another. The second is listening to the Spirit, and the third is listening to our communities. I need to go slightly back in time to come forward in time. I hope you'll bear with me, but it all links up. About 5 months before the pandemic hit, we had just completed and launched our mission action plan for the whole of the diocese at our synod, which is our kind of annual general meeting in November of 2020. And the year before that had been spent in a really deeply consultative process that included a lot of prayer, a lot of worship, town halls, surveys, interviews, and focus groups. And the question that we were seeking for was, what was the Diocese of Niagara's part in God's mission? Where was the Spirit of God leading us in the next 3 to 5 years? And we just wanted something to help give us a direction to travel in together. And the information we got back was encouraging, and it was fascinating. We came out of that process with 3 areas of focus. Faith formation, no surprise there. We're Anglican. We always need help appropriating and articulating our faith. We always need prayer help. And, everyone's got their strengths and weaknesses. It's good to be humble. Secondly, a principled loosening of diocesan structures to enable and support mission. And thirdly, we came out of it with a renewed focus on the outworking of the gospel, with a particular emphasis on what we thought was a calling to particularly lift up climate justice and the implementation of the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in our parishes and in our diocesan culture. And once we got into the weeds of what might follow in terms of actual actions from the mission action plan, other things revealed themselves. The need to shape the diocese as a whole, missionally, for instance. And, little did we know that what began life as a mission action plan or a map would become a lifeline in a pandemic. But it did. And even in the midst of this storm, we've managed to work at it. It was something to grab hold of. And that meant that we were embracing a change in culture from an inherited inward-looking maintenance culture to something that was more outward-looking, spirit-led and mission-oriented. Now, this didn't happen in a vacuum. The diocese was well underway in its appropriation of a missional paradigm. I think what we did was just give it a little nudge. So the most substantive thing to come out of that listening process and all that prayer was then distilling it into action, was a need for education and formation for mission. We knew we needed to reorient our focus on ministry with, to, and for the unchurched and the dechurched. And to do that, we needed to recapture our why for the diocese, the church. And of course, that's Jesus. We exist because we're the gathered community of Jesus followers, and we want to continue to share the good news in our culture and context. And we really wanted to be deeply intentional about that and thorough. But for that, we needed some new skills, some different skills for ministry. And so we needed a way to learn them. Talk about a school for continuing education with a missional focus began to emerge, a school for everyone, for folks who are ordained and not ordained, a school for Christian leaders who want to learn how to connect with our culture again, who wanted to love this world the way God does and to find a language to speak that love, a school that would shape people to be part of God's mission. So the Niagara School for Missional Leadership was born. We presented all that to Synod and we began to make some preliminary plans for it. And then the pandemic hit and we were in crisis mode for a few months. And then we realized that although the pandemic was truly terrible, it had opened up some opportunities for us as well. Some things we could no longer do, and that freed up some time to work at things like the school. So I put together a launch committee, and away we went. And we spent the year planning and trialing pilot courses like Mission 101, missional preaching. We've just finished a pilot course about new monasticism and one on rebooting traditional parishes. The courses are short. They're taught by folks who have actually done the ministry they're teaching. They're also praxis-based. They're not academic in focus. They're short, intense bursts of information based on an action reflection model, and they're designed to reorient parish and diocesan culture to mission. We've got a really exciting lineup of courses for our hard launch in the fall: adaptive leadership, missional stewardship, how to be good treaty people, because a missional church is by definition not a colonial church, a Christian foundations course, and so on. We've got 9 courses in all. And the thing is, by listening to the diocese, to our people's hopes and dreams and needs, I think we've tapped into something important. There was a longing, a real hunger to serve God in different ways, in ways that connect with people outside our church walls. We're really well aware it might not work, but we'll learn as we go. And to use that well-worn COVID-tide word, we'll pivot as much as we can. So the next story I put under the heading of listening to the Spirit. You might reasonably have thought that in the middle of a pandemic, it's not the time to launch new missional communities. Well, you'd be wrong. So something is happening in Niagara, something interesting. Just before the pandemic, a new, I think I can call it an intentional community, was taking shape in an old Anglo-Catholic parish called St. Luke's in North Hamilton. I was about to shutter that church and rectory when, as a result of, honestly, prayer and a relationship of trust, a remarkable and truly Spirit-led collaboration with another denomination arose. And there's a leader there he's discerning a call to ordained ministry in the Anglican Church, and he's begun this intentional community there. But sometime around January, another community began to take form, this time at our cathedral. Now, I admit that I'd expressed a dream for a community like this to our new dean, but I don't think I really expected him to make it a reality with such speed. I had said that I agreed with the Archbishop of Canterbury, who said a few years ago that it would be really hard to effect renewal if there wasn't a praying community at the foundation, as all renewal of faith rests on prayer. And that I really longed for a community to intentionally pray for the renewal of the church and her ministries in Niagara. Literally a month later, the dean had gathered a small group of actually young people, not church young people, but actually young people, to pray for the diocese. And their number and the clarity of their calling grows weekly. Now, you might have thought that that was interesting, that there were 2 places with a similar expression of community and ministry. But there are 3 other places that I know of in which a praying and missionally oriented ministry is bubbling up from the surface. And these small communities, they're nascent, but they're grounded in tradition and in the practice of prayer. I mean, they're praying the morning office and the evening office. I mean, who knew that morning prayer and evening prayer were going to be the new thing that came out of COVID? And as I mentioned, one of our soft launch courses with the school is on new monasticism. I had invited a number of the praying intentional community members to be part of it. And there's now a lively conversation about this form of mission, a form that I genuinely think might be Niagara's organic contribution to new expressions of church. It's also a form of ministry and mission that can withstand a pandemic. There's no barrier to contemplative and intercessory prayer, and Zoom is a perfect vehicle for all that. And what's most interesting is that the majority of cases, of these new communities are being established and led by lay people. And I think that's a model that is a mark of the urging of the Spirit. That's what comes of listening to her. She's original and surprising and exciting. And I'm looking forward to what form these various communities will take. And all the while, I'm just tending them gently, watering when needed, and just generally and gently noticing the growth. So I'm on to my last category, and that's listening to our communities. Just a few vignettes. I spoke to a priest yesterday in the north of the diocese who described another budding ministry, which really touched my heart. The parish sits on the elbow of the Credit River in the north of the diocese, and the winter ice carved a deeper channel for the river than usual this past year, and it exposed a rocky beach. And this is all in the backyard of the parish. So people in the spring from the community started showing up, and the priest noticed this, and so he started showing up when there were people out there and having conversations with folks who came on the weekends and in the mornings with their kids to skip stones and just generally mess around. And this priest in full black clericals also has young children, 3 boys. He's known around town as a good sort. And the conversations he had naturally turned to spiritual matters after a few pleasantries, some to counseling and some to confession. And some members of the church got to know of his reaching out, and they thought it would be a good idea to welcome the visitors too and their kids with a small gift. So they bought a bunch of bottles of bubbles and left them with a note of welcome from the members of the church in a bucket to the side of the river. And so some of the people, the visitors, decided to have a whip round to thank the church for their welcome. So they made a donation to the ministry of the church. So there's a community of unchurched and dechurched folks that's forming under the care and the welcome of the parish. It may be nothing else ever than that, but who knows? The priest in question has also been attending the new monasticism course through the Niagara School for Missional Leadership. So that felt a bit significant too. Now, during the pandemic, as in other parts of the diocese, as many as a dozen parishes realized something that as they listened hard for where they could help their communities. They learned that food security was going to be a real issue. It's a big one, and especially in some of the more depressed areas in the diocese. So they all partnered in one way or another with other parishes of different denominations or with restaurants or shelters to provide meals. And that also led to care and support for the isolated, a lot of elderly folks. And when I heard about these COVID ministries, I began to ask for donations for a pandemic response fund each Sunday in our diocesan service that we live stream so that we could help to support these ministries financially. I was floored. Thousands of dollars poured in, and we were able to partner with parishes who'd partnered with community groups to feed the hungry. Last thing, I mentioned our diocesan service. Well, the Sunday that I sadly had to shutter all the churches last March, I began to live stream prayers with Bishop Susan. I felt it was something I could do to unite and encourage the diocese and maybe provide some respite for those parishes who didn't yet have the capability to broadcast a service. I did not expect the response we had. In those early days, the number of views was surprising. Thousands every week were tuning in. Now, those numbers dropped as parishes tooled up and began offering their own services online, but we've retained a solid 1,000 views each week for well over a year now, and that number climbs around principal feast days. And we have, and this has happened all around the diocese, discovered a new mission field online. We offered parishes across the diocese access to a technology grant so that they can buy the equipment they need to plan for online worship far into the future. The question that's on everyone's minds, and Ross, you mentioned this as well, and it's a great question to have, is how do we continue to minister to that constituency when and as we return to in-person worship? I haven't got the answer, but we're listening and we'll experiment. You know, I could go on. There's the Anglican Family Hub, which is online Sunday school and children and youth programming that originated in Niagara too, and it was accessed all across the country. Online Alpha, as you've mentioned, is taken off with a pilot in one parish in each of our areas, all supporting each other through one cycle. There's a youth online exploration of Christianity through an Anglican lens called Why Believe. That had great pickup. Over a dozen young people grilled the bishop one night. We've been doing anti-racism training for our clergy, and a working group is working on an all-diocese training course that will be mandatory in time. There's lots. The pandemic, it's been a scourge. But somehow it's freed many of our folks to focus on what is really important to the outworking of their faith. It's freed them to listen to their context, to their people, to the communities that the parishes are planted in. And we will try and harvest all of the learnings that we can from this time. But as much as it has been very, very difficult, it's also thrown up some incredible blessings as well.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the invitation. As Judy mentioned, I work very closely with my dear friend Elle Pike. We often do things together, so I'm feeling just a little bit lonely right now without her. But I think that the pandemic for most of us has brought some things to the table, and it's taken some things away from us. And so in my presentation tonight, I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about and how we might sort through that stuff. But before we get to that, I want to remind you, and I think Ross did an excellent job, and this is just my version of reminding you that the problems for the church didn't start in February or March of 2020. So I do want to remind you what some of the church strategies we were employing, way too many of us were employing before the pandemic, before I start talking about where we might go next. So I'm just going to share my screen here real quick and start with my favorite church strategy, and that is the sit and wait church. I call this the church of the immaculate disconnection. So these are the people who are waiting in here inside the church, and we're waiting for the world out there to change. And once people out there realize how wrong they are about people in here, or once the authorities fix all the people out there, then people are going to start coming back. Well, this sit and wait church is going to be sitting and waiting for a while. So then there are some of us who think, well, maybe we shouldn't just sit and wait. Maybe we should invite people to join us. Maybe we should do something. And this group we call the attractional church. And so the idea behind the attractional church is we create programs and events that we do inside the church, and they provide pathways for people to come in so that they can enter inside the church and come and meet Jesus. Now, there are also this group called the evangelistic church. Oh, I had all these animations. Look at that. Isn't that exciting? It's amazing what you can do with PowerPoint from 2005. The evangelistic church. So this is a group of people that they figured out, look, we know that people aren't going to come in here. So what we need to do is we need to go where the people are, and we need to create programs and events that go out there and connect with the people. And then the programs and events will bring people in. So look at that. We go out, we get the people, watch the animations, very entertaining. And then they come in here inside the church, and that's where they can meet Jesus. Now, I want to talk about another kind of church, and Ross has spilled the beans on it, and Susan's used this word before. But before we get to that new kind of church, I just want to remind us that this didn't work. It didn't work. With the assumption always that Jesus is inside the church building, and we need to do everything we can to get people in the building so they can meet Jesus. Now, the thing that we need to recognize about COVID is that there were industries that did very well. For instance, if I had known pandemic was going to strike, I would have invested in a little company called Zoom, because I would be rich. But I never time anything right, and I don't really know how to invest. So there's a couple reasons why I'm not rich today. But COVID has helped certain industries, and it has decimated other industries. And the church, I know we're not an industry, but the church as an organization and an institution, this was a natural disaster for us. And so I want you to get in your mind what a natural disaster looks like. Imagine a giant storm comes in and it levels a whole town, or it destroys a neighborhood. And we have to flee our neighborhood. We can't be there while the storm is happening. And then we're finally allowed to come back and visit where we used to live. Now, if you think about that, to me, that is where the church stands right now. Some of us are being allowed back into the neighborhood, and our work in the next 12 months is going to follow 3 phases. The first phase is clean up. You got to get into your church. You can't just hop in the driver's seat, turn the key, and imagine it's just going to go on like it was March 2nd, 2020. You're going to go in, you're going to turn the key, and your church is going to go, roar, 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 roar. And so what we need to do is we need to clean up. We have to follow a 3-phase plan. First is we need to clean up. We need to pull the tree branches off. We need to find the family photo albums on the front lawn. We have to scrape things into a pile. The second phase of this next period for the church is assessment. So what got broken? Because in any storm, not everybody's house gets hurt in exactly the same ways. Maybe there's a tree fallen through my roof, but it didn't fall through your roof. Maybe the windows all busted. Maybe my house flooded and yours didn't. But we have to do a damage assessment. And what you're doing in a damage assessment is you're going through and you're sorting. You're not just stacking things into a pile. You're saying, well, what of my house still works? And there are things in your church that still work. But there are going to be lots of things that are broken. And then the third phase is when we move into the rebuilding phase. And rebuilding is kind of fun because if you have things torn down and you never liked where that wall was in the first place and it's gone, that's an opportunity to do something brand new. So I say this because what I'm very worried about is that the church isn't going to honor these steps. Most of us really enjoy the idea of number 3. But if you don't do the work of 1 and 2, you don't do 3 very well. And I think most of us, especially those who are in leadership in the church, have very deep concerns that our churches are going to try to cut corners and speed through some of the things that they need to do. So let's now talk about what going through COVID was like as part of the church. So you can see here in my little diagram, way less animation in this. I'm sorry, I didn't have time. But instead of everyone being able to come from their various homes around beautiful Saskatoon and come to my church at the outskirts of my city, we were all forced to participate in our homes. And one of the things that COVID did is instead of doing everything in the building, we had people participate in their homes. And we made families and homes the center of our churches. Did you notice on your Zoom church on Sunday morning, kids took on a new life of their own? That there was the chaos of how do we do this as a family, small family? How do we pay attention? And so we wrestled with this world that was so different, But I want to point out that families and homes became the center of the church. And that is something I think might be worth trying to bring into the future. We simplified our components of our life together. All of us did a massive ecclesiology project. Ross dropped that $50 word in the middle of the table during his presentation, but all of us asked the question, what is the church? Or what is the church now? What can we do? And we simplified and we made doable just about every aspect of the church. And I think that's something else for us to pay attention to. That's a gift that's been given to us, is that thinking and sorting that we did. The other thing that we did, and this was almost forced on us, is that we began to incorporate network thinking and not just neighborhood thinking. Now, this gets me in trouble in missional circles because they love to talk about the neighborhood. And I love it when churches talk about the neighborhood. But I also want churches to think about networks and not just neighborhoods. Now, I can get into that a bit more in the questions if you have further questions what I mean by that. But basically what we did was we made it easier for people to enter into their neighborhood and to experience church where they lived. Now, and often that wasn't in physical space. The other thing that COVID did for us is that it allowed us to refract the light of church, the thing that we did. And we refracted that in our little corners. So, have you ever had this experience? There's lots of clergy on the call. Have you ever had this experience where you preach a sermon, but you wish people could remember it past the parking lot and once they enter their house? Well, guess what? While you preached during COVID, people were in their house, living their lives in a much more seamless way. And they were refracting the message from your church, and they saw it. They saw their neighbors, perhaps, across the street while you were preaching. They saw their own family, their own house, their own possessions. Their whole world was brought into the church space. And these are gifts. These are things that happened during COVID. And our whole energy as a church community is that instead of trying to get everybody to come in, we did all we could to empower what people were already doing. So if people were engaged in a home church with just their family, we were empowering that. If people could get together with their neighbors in a backyard, we were empowering that. If people wanted to connect with their friends, co-workers, people that they had met online, we were empowering that. And if you're wondering what it is that church leaders want you to do, it's actually to begin adapting your energy in this way. To empower the lives and the ministry of all the people in your congregation. COVID made us do something that most of us have been hoping we could do for a long time. So, with that, I thought it might be good for us to just share. I'm just going to share a couple quick stories of some things that I saw. So one was in my own house. Every week, my sons and my wife, we would gather around the kitchen table. I got up early. I baked bread like everybody else. There was toilet paper and bread are the two things that came out of this pandemic. So I got up early. I baked bread, and we followed the liturgy. We read the passages. We spoke to one another about what we were hearing, and because I'm a reverend, I felt okay that I could administer communion. Now I know that's a debatable point in some corners. Evangelicals were a little bit crazy and non-sacramental, and that created some good things, but it's also not that great either. But home-centered faith, I hope that is something that you paid attention to, because it's beautiful, it's important, and it's a deep part of the Christian tradition. And it goes back as far as when we were deeply a part of the Jewish faith. So that's an important discovery. Another thing that I wanted to just throw out into the middle of the table here is that exclusively online churches started during COVID. Churches that have no intention of ever really truly being a physical church. Now, I don't have time to talk to you about what all of those are in my presentation, because I want to get to the questions, but essentially, some churches never changed at all. Now, in the church world, a lot of us are getting tired of Zoom. A lot of us are getting tired of interacting online. But there's a generation gap there I have to warn you about. We have been couch surfing in the digital natives world. So in my generation, I'm sort of a hybrid, but I don't live exclusively in the digital world. But my sons, Generation Z, that is their world. And for in many ways, very little about their life changed. And so they are actually part of a Christian community online. They hang out on Discord all day. There are open microphones in my house all the time. So anytime I knock on my son's door and I say, "Can I come in?" I always have to say, "Are we alone?" And that's because he might have 8 friends. And if I yell at him for not taking the recycling out, I look like an insane parent. So I always have to check before disciplining my kids now. But these digital natives, they had started something where they met exclusively online. That's how their church worked. And there are now seeds that got planted during the pandemic. My son had a young man on our back deck this Sunday that he had never met physically before. But he has been carrying out a serious spiritual conversation with this person for literally months and months and months. And now they have plans, now that physical meetings and things can happen, they have plans for what they can do, how they can go on mission in our city. So there is a dimension of location, geography, all of those things. But really, we have to get used to this idea that networks really do matter, and they are an important part. So as I mentioned to you, some churches actually started, and the idea of a regional or a national or even an international church has never been more possible. You don't have to be the Crystal Cathedral and have a very expensive broadcasting television show to do something brand new. The church has always used technology. One of the things I loved about what Ross shared there, the passage, the apostle was actually using a brand new technology, writing and sending letters as a representation and a way to lead. And Christianity, believe it or not, has often been on the vanguard of using technology. And we can be on the vanguard of this as well. Another thing that I think we need to pay attention to is that of the phenomenon of increased accessibility. So online gathering has created the possibility of my parents using Zoom. If I had asked my parents to use Zoom, it never would have worked. But because they were forced to use Zoom, they know how to do it now. And my dad's helped me remodel my kitchen. He's a cabinet maker. He's 2,800 kilometers away, and he has helped me fix my drawers, for instance. There are new possibilities that you can use that people will expect you to use, and you should use as you move forward. But I also want to point out that some people who physically couldn't get to our churches or in our churches were able to access our community because we're online. people who emotionally were unable to access our churches were able to connect online. I had a friend who had severe agoraphobia and a lot of social anxiety, and he rejoined church after a number of years because it was online. And then I think most of us have discovered it's really cool that people from all over the place are able to connect. Susan told lots of those stories. And then my final thought here of what can happen during this is that I hope, and I know there are churches who are planning to practice permanent hybridity. So that means they will be both a physical church and an online church. And it's neither of those is ever going to go away. So let me just give you a quick idea of what that might look like. One, the church building will only be one of the locations that the church meets regularly. Okay? We've said for a long time, as Ross pointed out, and most of us have pointed out for literally decades, that the church building should not be the focus of our life together. And this is something that's changed. Simplified liturgy that can be practiced anywhere that a person is. So instead of asking someone to stand up and read the scriptures from the microphone to podium, why can't you ask Aunt Betty, who is in the old folks' home and physically has not been able to come to church, why can't she read the scriptures over the screen through her iPad? So the liturgy can take place not just on site where you broadcast out, but the outside can broadcast in to the site. Okay? And then the pastor could be preaching from a variety of locations. So don't always just center preaching from the church building. What if you preach from my back deck? What if you came and sat on my couch? What if you came and hung out with the Johnsons at their cottage? There are all kinds of brand new possibilities, especially around permanent hybridity. I got a ton more, but I think I should just quit there because I think I've gone over time